those feelings are real and they're big.
Yep.
And to try not to minimize, which in the moment, as a parent and as a teacher, I've wanted to do. Because I just want to get through this.
Right.
I just want this to go. And
Right.
we can,
I just need to go to
away.
school.
Right. Yeah, totally. Gotta get there. Totally. Right?
Welcome to Hallway Conversations. We're a trio of educators who have plenty of questions about teaching and learning and school culture, and we believe in the value of collaboration and reflection as we seek to keep growing as teachers. So this podcast is our place for thinking out loud together about issues in education and why they might matter to Christian educators. Welcome to the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hallway Conversations. My name's Matt Beamers.
I'm Dave Mulder.
I'm Abby DeGroat.
As always, we want to thank you for allowing the three of us to be here with you. And we want to thank you for joining us in the hallway this week. Each week, one of us brings a question, and we try to think creatively around it in the context of what it means to teach Christianly. We are good friends who love each other and love engaging each other in conversation about our practice. And our deep hope is that you are enriched and encouraged in your own work and maybe even in your own everyday walking around life. And while we have a long list of topics we want to talk about, we want to know what hallway conversations you would like to hear. So if you have ideas or questions or feedback even about this podcast for us, or simply want to share what hallway conversations you're having, please email us at hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. It's hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. Today's question actually comes from one of our listeners on the east coast of Canada, also known as the Maritimes, I believe Prince Edward Island.
That's right.
So this question comes from Loretta, so here's the question.
I'm Loretta Anderson from Prince Edward Island, Canada. I teach first and second grade at Emmanuel Christian School in Charlottetown, PEI, and honored to ask the question for today's podcast. Since teaching and supporting students is so much more than just teaching academics, as you've talked about so often in many of your conversations, my wondering for today is I'm wondering how can teachers support social and emotional development in the classroom? Can't wait to hear this conversation.
Thanks for the question, Loretta. First of all, before we answer the question, I just want to say, Loretta, that it is my dream to come to Prince Edward Island.
Me too.
It is, from everything I've read, everything I've watched about, it is one of the most beautiful places in Canada. And so anyways, thanks for your question, Loretta. I just want to really confess that this is an area of growth, I think, for all three of us. Like this is, when I hear this question, I'm as intrigued by this conversation just in my own learning and in my own growth, but I also come recognizing that there's a big gap and lots of room for growth in this area. So, Abby, I know you say the same, but I'm gonna start with you if that's okay. And what are some thoughts that come to your mind?
Right, and I'd say my kind of biggest in to this topic is twofold. One, just parenting, right, which will teach you socio and emotional learning quickly. And just we are nearing the end of my children's school year, and the days are long, and they don't want to come inside anymore. And we had a morning where I needed to put some of my socio and emotional learning skills to use, right? So, because those emotions are real, and you have to learn how to validate those and respond to them as parents. So that's kind of one of my approaches. And also, I teach our development course here, so our Ed Site courses, and so we talk a lot with future teachers about what it means to teach the whole child. And we actually, in my Intro to Ed Site class, right, we go through domains of development. We have a whole chart of physical development, cognitive development, socio-emotional development, spiritual development, language development. What does that all look like? How do those interplay? We use the terms splintered, right, development, so students can be really just making beautiful progress in one of those domains and be really struggling in another, and to recognize that we kind of used the illustration of I'm going to appeal to you, Dave, the math guy. What are those beads that you can put on the
Oh, like on an
like
abacus.
abacus.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you. I couldn't think of the word. Right. So you have kids who are way over here in one area and way over here in other areas,
Sure.
and you also have in your class students who are at all different places all at once. Right. So it's just this myriad of development and how those domains interplay, and you can't ignore any of them.
And just hearing you say that makes me think of the years that I spent as a middle school teacher, and you see probably the most diversity in all these developmental domains at any time in their schooling, like 7th graders. Man, like I had 7th grade homeroom for all these years, and you see that playing out, right? Kids who are developing very rapidly physically, but they might be behind, so to speak, I'll put my air quotes, in terms of their social and emotional development or their spiritual development, right?
Yes.
And yeah, how those impact each other, it all matters.
Yeah, it does. There's interplay there.
Right.
They all are playing back and forth, right? Because if I don't have the socio-emotional skills that I need, that impacts my cognitive ability to learn things in a classroom, right? Yeah. Or if I have physical insecurities, that's going to impact my socio-emotional health. So it all interplays inside the student and then in your classroom. It's so seeing that all, and that's kind of where I come to this conversation, but also admit that when I was a practicing K-12 teacher, while I think implicitly I practiced some socio-emotional learning goals with students, I don't know that I had language for it.
Yeah.
No, I think about that too. I know there's a focus on social emotional learning and development, and even though there's more of a focus, I think it's always been important.
Right.
But there's more language to it. And I think about my own teachers, growing up, is that whatever they wanted to call it, they intuitively knew, some intuitively knew the importance of care that allowed all the other things to happen in the classroom, that when you feel cared for and safe. And but it does make me realize, right, like in some ways, the focus on social emotional learning in some areas, if I'm honest, I've seen some pushback on this a little bit. People, but I do think, like, as teachers who are followers of Jesus, this isn't really an option for us. Like, this isn't I can or I can't, or it's if this is who these children are created to be. Like, we're created to be emotional beings, and we have needs, and to dismiss the importance of this doesn't diminish the academics. Right?
That's right.
Dave, you always say this is a school. That's what we're here for.
Yeah.
But in some ways, I think it actually honors that part, right?
Yeah.
Like, for that to happen, we need to also care for the whole child. And as children of God, like I said, they're emotional beings, and to not deal with it is in some ways, for me, to deny the image of God that is in them. So in some ways, it's to deal with it is not only important for there, but it's also to validate who they are as children of God.
Hearing you say that, Matt, I remember I had a conversation, this is years and years ago, the principal of the school I was teaching at, and I had a conversation. You mentioned pushing back a little bit against this idea of social emotional, and you're right, I always go like, but we're a school, first of all, we're about academics. And we were having a conversation about that, and my principal's comment to me was, David, I was teaching middle school, if you can get these middle schoolers socially and emotionally and spiritually through that time of their life, and you hope they learn something too, call it a success. Yeah. And I remember feeling appalled that he even said that. Like, but we're a school. Yeah. But I think he's right. Like, looking back, if we're neglecting those pieces of it, like, we have to address these things.
Because school is formative, right? We say that all the time, right? If we're forming students, how can we not care about those just integral parts of their being?
No, and it also makes me realize, like, especially during this past year, which is the most complex, the last 12, 15 months have been the most complex years of, couple of years of education. But it also makes me realize, like, for some, how school is just a hard place to be, right? Like, I can remember saying to some students this year, and that's, for some students, school is the safest 6 or 7 hours of their day, and how you're going to nurture and care and teach. And the reality is, for those other students, it's the hardest 6 or 7 hours of their day, where they just want to be home. And I've seen that in my own family this year. We've moved to a different country. We've moved to a different school. So all of it, like, and a daughter entering the school system where she knows very little people. And school is a hard place for her to be, and she's okay for me to share that. And even just having, one teacher not that long ago where she was almost apologetic that she's missed a number of days. And he said to her, he said, like, don't worry about the days you missed. Like, I'm so proud of all the days that you've been here, because I'm sure this has been so hard. And just that feeling of validating, of saying, for her to hear from an adult, it makes sense to me that this was such a hard year for you. Let's celebrate the good things that have happened. Man, she needed to hear that. And as a parent, you pray for that.
Oh, yeah.
That someone just acknowledges the hardness of things. Abby, I know you do this with your own kids.
Well, this has been a big piece of learning for me, actually, in the last year, right? Is thinking through the seeds that I'm planting in my own kids, and what I want my girls, for example, to the internal dialogue I want them to have at 16 when they're having a feeling or something in their gut that says this isn't right, this isn't the way that it's supposed to be. And if I have constantly told them you're fine, stop, stop crying, you are, it's not a big deal, it's not, just get over it. What's going to happen when they're 16 and they're in this situation with friends and they have a feeling in their gut that something is not right? Do I want their internal dialogue to be, it's fine, I just need to get over it, it's probably not a big deal? Or do I want them to be able to trust the feelings that they are having and expressing when they're 8? Right? And so I've tried to, there's a couple of lines that we've talked about, right, that I've tried to insert into my lexicon, like, I believe you. This doesn't feel right. I said that to my 5-year-old this morning. Right? When I really wanted to leave.
And how does he respond to that, if I can ask,
so this morning he was literally on the floor. And it was him and it was my dog. And they were on the floor. And it's his last day of preschool, and I don't know if that's where this is coming. He was tired. We were up late last night. It's summer, right? He just was having a hard time. And I said, you're just having a hard time, buddy. Something doesn't feel right. Do you just need to be held? And he shook his head, and he climbed into my arms, right? And I could just feel it. All he needed was for me, when I was like, I'm sure school will be great. That wasn't working.
Yeah, totally.
Right.
He doesn't care in the moment.
No, he needed me to say, I see that something isn't right here.
Yep.
I believe you. Yeah. Let's get through it. And then after, literally 5 minutes later, I took a picture of him that I posted on Instagram where he's beaming, right? He just needed that validation to be able to come out of that.
Which makes me think of the story I just shared about my daughter, right? Like, just have an adult. My kid, totally. My kids will always say, I feel seen right now. Yep. But in a sense, that is what it is, right? I see you, I understand. It makes sense to me that you feel that way. And there's no buts about it. There's no, I understand you feel that way. Now let's get to school. No, it just makes sense to me. Let's just pause for a second.
Okay. So now I want to push forward. I'm not pushing back.
Yes.
So on Twitter, and I'm on Twitter too much, you guys, but the problem that I see with Twitter,
podcast.
that's a whole other time. You only get it 280 characters at a time, right?
Yeah.
So of course it's going to be sound bites, but there is so much dialogue and discourse on Twitter about social and emotional learning today. And it just seems so fraught in so many ways, and people want to politicize this right away, and that's not what I'm getting at here. But the phrase I keep seeing is Maslow before Bloom. You got to do your Maslow before you can do Bloom. And what people mean by that, I think, is, okay, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and people have physical needs, and they have safety needs, and they have psychological needs, and hopefully eventually they reach self-actualization, right? So you got to deal with their needs before you can do Bloom's. Would be like Benjamin Bloom, Bloom's taxonomy, right? Like levels of thinking, higher order thinking skills. And stuff. And I appreciate where people are coming from when they say that, but I just want to. But can't it be both of those at the same time? And maybe that's my short-sightedness and my lack of understanding of this. But it's I don't think these have to be mutually exclusive. That we can address both the academic demands of school and address social and emotional needs at the same time. Does that seem right, or am I way off in left? Call me out in left field if I'm wandering away here.
It makes sense to me, right? And how is good pedagogy connected to socio-emotional learning?
Yes.
How are those the same and intertwined and not separate parts of the day.
Thank you for naming it that way, because I think that's what I'm really trying to say. Like, what are we doing then in the classroom in terms of our pedagogy that actually enhances and supports this kind of social and emotional development?
Right.
And I don't have any answer for that.
No, but it does. But it also makes me think then, how are we? What are we defining? Like, where is learning taking place? Like, part of that sometimes I wonder if if I'm not doing the formal curriculum, then am I not doing? Then I'm not doing. Then I'm not blooming anymore, right?
What's that?
Whereas, as I think, something simple like a check-in circle in the morning, right? Like I've just become such a big believer.
Right.
I was in a school where I've mentioned Ashley Bowker before. Every morning a campfire question. I could literally go every classroom almost every morning. There would be a check-in circle for 10 or 12 minutes. Now, some people might say, well, that's Maslow, but I would also say, yeah, but that's also Bloom. Like, there's also higher order thinking going there. You're learning about yourself. You're learning about others. You're learning to articulate your emotions and your feelings. And to me, that's good pedagogy, right? And so, so maybe part of it is, I think my wonder is when we talk about you have to Maslow before you bloom, is if we're seeing social emotional learning as sort of an add-on. Like, this is something I have to do to get to that. And I do think there is a bit of that, right? Like, there is a bit of knowing your kids. Like, school kids are coming to school with trauma. They're coming out of hard stories. And you just can't simply say, well, I'll take care of you by teaching a good lesson, and don't worry about your emotions. Like, I think that I can do that quite easily, actually.
Sure.
Right? Like, I'll work it through. It is a both and. But sometimes seeing it as a both and, my worry with it a bit is sometimes then it becomes an excuse to not do it. Or just say, I do this through my teaching. And if you're going to do it through your pedagogy, boy, you better plan for it within your pedagogy.
That it has to be deliberate.
And not assume that it's going to happen. Like,
that's true.
Like, hey, I love building relationship through pedagogy, through teaching and learning. But again, those check-in circles become really important, right? And they allow you to do other things around Bloom that you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't spend the time there. So in that sense, they both I think they both happen at the same time. But I also think if you go straight to Bloom, are you actually where are you going to get on that taxonomy? Because hey, like, if I don't feel cared for and I have needs, and part of that is then getting to know your students, right? Like, we can think about that as a faculty. What does Dave Mulder need today is different than what Abby DeGroot needs today. Like, you sent us a podcast, Abby, that I thought was absolutely fascinating. I think we're going to put a link to it on our page. And the person that was speaking was Nicole Batiste, I believe was her name, and she had this one. It was incredible. So I thought the whole podcast, professionally and personally, was an encouraging and challenging. But she had this one line where she talked about this idea of like, where we sometimes use this line of, hey, I treat my kids as my own, and I get the sentiment of that. I've said it myself, right? Like, I love them so much, So I treat my students as my own, as I would treat my own children. And it was interesting because the push forward on that was sort of actually don't treat your children as your own, because what your children need is different what child needs. What Dave needs is different than what Abby needs is different than what Matt needs. And that's where I guess for me, when you focus on the relationship and the math, then you say what do these students need that will allow me to get to all those other things. Like, you can't get out the door to school to do all those other things until your son hears, I believe you, or for my daughter to hear from Mr. Bayama, I'm proud of how often you were here. And that allows so many other things to happen. So I understand the push forward on it, Dave. I also want to make sure that we don't use it as an excuse to bypass it.
Correct. I agree.
Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah.
I like that. I think too, one area that is important when talking about socio-emotional learning, I think, with students that we need to recognize is that it can be hard on teachers to stay calm and to stay socio-emotionally healthy in the presence of really hard things in students' lives and the behavior then that they use to communicate those hard things, right? And that's something I think I struggled with as a beginning educator. Was being reactive to students' behavior instead of seeing what's underneath that behavior and the issues of the problems or the things that needed to be seen in those students.
Sure.
Well, it makes me think now, going back to the other podcast that I listened before we recorded this, where there's this line of like, where Nicole Batiste uses this line of all behavior is communication, right? Like, what is your son communicating in that moment, or my daughter, or like even understanding that in a classroom that, and sometimes I think, especially when I started teaching, it was, man, I took those things personally. Like, this is something that has to do with me, or what am I doing wrong, or like, why aren't they respecting the office of teacher? When in reality, it's like, this actually, for the most part, has nothing to do with you. Like, this is about that. Right? And whether you get to know what the that is or not, it rarely has to do with school or with you as a teacher, right? So I thought that was a really, really important line, is like, hey, what is this student communicating to me, and what can I communicate back that will help them in that moment. And I keep coming back to what you said, Abby, about, hey, those feelings are real and they're big.
Yep.
And to try not to minimize, which in the moment, as a parent and as a teacher, I've wanted to do, because I just want to get through this.
Right.
I just want this to go. And
right.
I just
need to go to school.
Right. I totally. Gotta get there. Totally. Right. And so, I really appreciate.
But yeah,
that.
so often when you try to do that and rush through that, it backfires, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The podcast that we're talking about is actually hosted by one of my friends from grad school that I go to the University of Florida with. Yeah, Donald Nicholas. And the person he interviews, Nicole, has a website that she's created for teachers. So it's called Hub for Helpers, and it's also, she has a Facebook page where she has a lot of really helpful information posted for teachers to seamlessly integrate these kinds of tools like you're talking about, these zones of regulation, right? Just printables and where are you, and naming emotions, and just like there's a cool like what are you today, like with little like clothespins that you can put around a circle. So things like that are just tangible and easily integrated into everyday. So I encourage you, we'll put a link there, but check that out too. But there's a ton of really good resources there as well.
No, thanks. I want to say thanks to you for sharing that, and just the encouragement and wisdom. And I encourage everyone to go from this podcast to that.
They have a lot more expertise than we do.
Things that we
go listen
about but don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
For sure. Friends, we know that your time is valuable. We want to thank you. We want to thank Loretta for your question today. We want to thank the rest of you for joining us for another hallway conversation. And whether it is this day, this week, this month, this school year, we hope that the Lord gives you what you stand in need of this day and to end your well. We want to thank you for the good, God-delighting work you're doing in your schools, and for the way that you care for your students and the way that you love them. And as you go into this week, we just want to bless you and say, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace, and give you peace, and give you peace. Amen. Have a good week, everyone. Thank you.
This podcast was quite literally dreamed up during one of our actual hallway conversations. Our music is by Ethan Mulder. Hallway Conversations is an independent podcast created and produced by Matt Beamers, Abby DeGroat, and Dave Mulder. Thanks for listening.